70 years after the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty, has NATO outlived its purpose? Is the alliance a source of stability or a threat to international peace and security? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Ghida Fakhry. The 70th anniversary of NATO was a celebrated affair here in Washington, but it's also been a tense time for the alliance. Donald Trump has criticized NATO members for their lack of military spending and has wavered in his support for the principle of collective defense. In a few moments, we'll hear from the former head of US Central Command, Admiral William Fallon, about the changing role of the alliance. But first we go to Libya, where NATO launched airstrikes in 2011 following Muammar Gaddafi's crackdown on protesters. President Obama said it was the right thing to do, but that planning for the day after was the biggest mistake of his presidency. 8 years on, as the country relapses into violence and internal military conflict, we hear reflections from Libyans on the NATO intervention.
بالنسبة للثوار اللي مع الثورة كلهم فرحانين بتدخل الناتو في البداية، ولكن اتضح فيما بعد أن الناتو راهو كان قصدي يفترض يكون لديه خطة يعني بديلة. تجي تضرب وتمشي هذه مش كافية. المفروض تجميع السلاح والتوحيد المؤسسة العسكرية والمساعدة الليبيين مثل العسكريين باستشارة والتدريب وعدم ترك امور هكذا يعني خلوها في فوضى ليبيا توا.
انا ضد الناتو انه يتدخل في ليبيا. احنا شنو هو وقعنا؟ كانت العراق. ما دام العراق تحطمت هيك دولة العراق، ما حتى ليبيا مستقبلها زي 8 سنين. شنو الحاجة الحلوة ترى اللي صارت في البلاد؟ ما غير الطريق مكسرة، قاعدة مكسرة. يا سيدي نقول لك معمر البنية التحتية صح متحطمة، صح مدارس ضعيفة، صح هذا كله، بس احنا ما زدناش حاجة أحسن منها، بالعكس زدنا حطمنا حتى اللي كان موجود. الناتو يعني أنت شنو لك علاقة بليبيا باش تجي تضرب يعني وتقولي نبي نأيد الناتو؟ ربما كان حتى عندي ميول أن أنا ضد معمر، لكن بعد الناتو لا.
هو تفويض من مجلس الأمن للحرب على ليبيا بطريقة بدريعة حماية المدنيين وحظر الطيران، وانتم زي ما شفتوا يعني دمر البنى التحتية ودمر الجيش الليبي ولدرجة انه بدأ يستهدف في مساكن ومنازل المدنيين العزل. هو كان يوم 30 أغسطس 2011 الساعة 3:30 صباحا، كان آخر يوم في أيام شهر رمضان المبارك. كنت أنا واقف يعني في الشارع أمام المنزل، فجأة نسمع في صوت، والصوت نحسيه يقرب مني يعني. فجأة يمر زوج صواريخ، طبعا استخدموا معنا صواريخ GBU 12 الموجهة بالليزر. في لحظات صار انفجار غريب جدا لدرجة أني قعدت متمسك بالأرض على أساس أن الأرض كأنه زلزال في الأرض، وصبت بصدمة يعني ما نقدرش نوصف لك الحالة هذه. يعني عائلة كاملة يعني الأب والأم وأخ وأخت يعني زوج من يعني اللي هي هذه فرحة عمرها 9 سنوات.
NATO says it does everything possible to minimize the risk to civilians and was targeting a military command node on the day the houses were struck. But a UN Human Rights Council investigation did not find evidence of any military purpose for the airstrike. Now, on the streets of Washington, activists tell us it is the effect of interventions like this that push them to protest the very existence of NATO.
NATO is not a peacekeeping organization, so I don't think a 70th anniversary of a war machine should be celebrated.
I'm opposed to anyone who wants to perpetrate violence as a method to obtain peace.
No to NATO! Yes to peace!
NATO is a fear-mongering organization. They're able to sell more weapons because they sell fear.
Sell more weapons and leave the whole world with a bill.
You look at what it did in the Balkan countries.
Afghanistan, our longest war.
We've seen it decimate
countries like Libya.
NATO is provoking war with Russia. NATO has surrounded Russia and increased the risk of warfare.
The purpose of NATO has always been and continues to be to defend the interests of Western wealthy nations and their ability to exploit other nations that challenge their power or that may have moved towards a left, towards a socialist or a communist government.
So how does the view from the ground differ from those who led NATO operations? We're now joined by Admiral William Fallon. He was former head of U.S. Central Command under the Bush administration, where he directed all military operations in the Middle East, Central Asia and the Horn of Africa. During his 40-year career, he also served as commander of the Navy's 6th Fleet during NATO's combat operations in Bosnia. Admiral Fallon, lots of criticism here in Washington and in Libya towards NATO. For someone who served in many NATO operations, is that warranted criticism?
I think it's very narrow and distorted view that misses most of what NATO is about, why it was founded, the work that was done over many decades, and as it's evolved into trying to deal with current structures. So I just took a look at that film clip at the front of the story, and I was chagrined to see what I took as a complete lack of understanding. So NATO's done quite a bit for this world. Go back into the Cold War era, it was the bulwark of the Western defense against the Soviet Union in those difficult days of the Cold War, and it's functioned admirably, and I think the result really speaks volumes about the success of the organization in that it prevented a world war, which was quite likely and very much a concern during the Cold War.
But Admiral Fallon, that was back then, though, wouldn't you agree? Mm-hmm. NATO since has really moved well beyond its original mandate of collective security. Mm-hmm. Take Libya, for example. Mm-hmm. Should NATO really have gotten engaged in the business of regime change and removing Gaddafi, which was the ultimate aim from the beginning, wasn't it?
Well, it seems pretty clear in hindsight, maybe, but I think at the time the issue in Libya was one of insecurity, instability, and some desire to do something about it. So the countries, mostly in Western Europe, took the initiative to get involved in Libya and to try to tamp down the instability and set this country right.
But hasn't NATO in fact created a worse situation of instability and insecurity? If the aim was to keep Libya stable and secure for the sake of its neighbouring European countries, hasn't it backfired quite spectacularly? Because now you've got a lot of instability, slave trade going on, weapons in everyone's hands. If some of the NATO countries were afraid of having Gaddafi in their backyard, now they're left with ISIS in their backyard.
Well, there's no easy answer, I think, to this one. My personal thought at the time was that I would have been very reluctant to get the U.S. involved for a number of reasons, not least of which is the vast size of the territory and the unlikely event that we were going to have enough will to put enough forces in to really take over the whole country or stabilize it. So
are you saying it was a mistake? Was it a mistake in hindsight, though? Was NATO being used, manipulated for certain political aims?
Well, it isn't as cut and dried as that. There were good reasons for wanting to get involved, but I think it was not very well thought through, and frankly, it was not a well-planned operation. And my experience is that you don't get involved in these things. You don't pull military force into these kind of situations unless you've got a compelling reason and you've got a really well thought out plan. So in that context, it was a mistake to do it the way it was done. If there was an overarching desire on the part of the countries involved to want to get involved, then they should have had a much better plan.
How much did it undermine NATO's credibility to be used in the way it was? President Obama at the time said that the US was leading from behind, but was it really the case? Because to many people looking on, it seemed like NATO was providing cover for the US.
Well, the US wasn't leading at all. The US was reluctantly involved, in my opinion, and basically probably should have not been involved. But I think that we're fixating on what I believe is a relatively minor, albeit tragic situation in Libya. People made decisions. They didn't turn out particularly well, and things have evolved to an unstable situation. But I don't believe NATO is going back in any major way at all. And frankly, the discussion about NATO, in my opinion, should be back refocused on what it was formed to do, and that's collective defense of Western Europe.
So you're saying that, for example, large-scale ground operations like the one that NATO engaged in and is still mired in Afghanistan 17 years on should be moved away from, because it seems that the Libya scenario of a hit-and-run strategy by NATO was almost predicated by the fact that NATO failed so miserably in Afghanistan.
These are very different situations. And I've got some strongly held opinions, having been a commander responsible for that part of the world back some years ago. What I saw was a movement by NATO into Afghanistan for many of the wrong reasons. And the biggest one I recall was that Iraq, which a number had participated in 2003, became not very pretty, dangerous. And so Afghanistan at the time was very quiet and was viewed as an alternative to do something, but it was not dangerous and not particularly messy, and so countries went to Afghanistan, many of the NATO countries. However, what they did there was not particularly useful, in my opinion, for the country. And at the end of the day, it ended up with a large occupying force, if you would, of outsiders, which traditionally have not gone very well in Afghanistan. And so we went through this era, a rise in outsiders, now diminished significantly, and it's back to where it was before.
And so should it leave?
You don't want to leave altogether, and frankly, it's the U.S. involved. There's almost nobody else. I mean, let's be serious. We keep talking NATO, but the contribution of most of the countries is pretty nil, certainly today. But I think that NATO today can continue to make a very valuable contribution to the stability and security of this world.
Admiral William Fallon, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Sure.
Over the past 7 decades, the objectives of the alliance have transformed with the times. Katie Fisher takes a look back.
In Washington, the United States breaks a 170-year-old tradition as it joins 11 nations in the signing of the Atlantic Defense Treaty.
In 1949, European nations joined the United States in an alliance intended to defend Western Europe against any Soviet threat,
which for the first time binds this country to a military agreement during days of peace.
And 70 years on, the NATO Secretary General says the peace has been maintained.
No NATO ally has been attacked by another country. The Cold War ended without a shot being fired in Europe, and we have experienced an unprecedented period of peace.
Yet NATO did invoke Article 5, the principle of collective defense, for the first and only time after September 11th. Nevertheless, NATO's objective, even the alliance's existence, remains in question.
NATO's obsolete. I said it was obsolete. It's no longer obsolete.
So which is it? The alliance was created to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO's purpose became unclear. Yet it didn't disband, it expanded. NATO hedged eastward, with former Soviet republics joining the alliance, despite Russian opposition. Today, it includes 29 member states. NATO moved beyond its original mandate when it launched its first military combat operation in the Balkans in the mid-90s. Later, it intervened in the Horn of Africa, Libya, and Afghanistan, where 17,000 NATO troops are still based. For now, NATO's spending is on the rise, and the alliance says it's committed to modernizing. Finding consensus among 29 soon-to-be 30 diverse member states with different perceived threats is another challenge. Still,
it is good to have friends. Thank you.
And the friendship is certainly growing. The Republic of North Macedonia is expected to join NATO later this year, with Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia and Ukraine aspiring for membership as well. But is this growing alliance of friends provoking an already hostile relationship with Russia? To discuss, I'm joined by Kurt Volker. He was the United States ambassador to NATO from 2008 to 2009, and he is the executive director of the McCain Institute here in Washington. Ambassador Volker, since the end of the Cold War, 13 countries, 10 of which were part of the Warsaw Pact, have joined NATO. You are a strong proponent of NATO enlargement. Why?
Well, because this is about people making their own choices. These are free people who had Soviet troops on their soil during the Cold War, who felt that they were occupied, they were not able to choose their own governments. So when they had the chance to choose their own democratic governments, to become market economies, they also wanted to be safe. They wanted to make sure that what had just happened to them doesn't happen again.
But is this just about them wanting to feel safe? I mean, why is the US so intent, seemingly, to expand eastward, knowing full well how much it is provoking Russia? Just imagine for a moment Cuba, for instance, joining the Warsaw Pact. How would Washington have felt about that?
Well, it's exactly the opposite of what you said, though. So it's not been the United States' intent to try to bring countries in. It's these countries that were knocking at the door. If you remember, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. NATO, these countries wanted to join right away, and NATO said no. You need to be democracies, you need to be market economies, you got to have civilian control of the military, you have to fight corruption, you have to be like a NATO member in order to become a NATO member. And it was only in 1997, 8 years later, when the first 3 countries were invited to join. And 2002, so another 13 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the Baltic states or Slovakia or Slovenia were invited to join. So this has been a very slow process rather than a rushed process, and it's been driven by the countries that are seeking security.
You say it's been driven by the countries, but for the US, doesn't NATO enlargement, though, have less to do with these countries seeking security and stability and so-called shared values, and more to do with business? I mean, clearly, NATO expansion has secured a lot of lucrative deals for arms sales here in the US.
No, that's also wrong.
But the facts prove quite the opposite. Poland, in fact, famously signed the largest arms deal by a former Soviet bloc country after it joined NATO, a multi-billion-dollar agreement to buy 48 American-made Lockheed Martin fighter jets. The US offered Poland, on top of that, a low-interest government loan to finance the cost of the fighter jets, and the American ambassador to Poland at the time, Christopher Hill, called it, quote, the deal of the century.
Sure.
So clearly this is part of the equation.
But you're making an equation between the fact that the Poles wanted to buy American military equipment. They didn't want to be connected to Russia anymore. They wanted to change. And you're making a connection between that and the motivations for why NATO should be there to begin with. The U.S. sells arms around the world. Some of the biggest deals, much bigger than the ones in Central Europe and with other countries that will never be members of NATO. So you're drawing a connection between things that aren't connected.
Well, I'm not, but I mean, this whole Moscow saber rattling, it is music to their ears, isn't it? I mean, it has been good for business.
Well, Russia likes to rattle sabers, and that's why these countries want to feel secure. So the Baltic states, for instance, once they regained their independence, they desperately wanted to become part of NATO, so that would not be taken away from them again.
But let's be frank, as long as countries like Georgia and Ukraine pursue NATO membership, what is the incentive for Russia to normalize relations with them?
Well, just the other way around. Russia attacked these countries when they were not members of NATO. So it has taken 20% of Georgian territory. It has taken Crimea from Ukraine. It is continuing to fight a war in eastern Ukraine. And so these are very aggressive steps by Russia against countries that are not members of NATO.
Is Russia today an enemy?
Russia, interestingly, recently just defined the United States as an enemy, defines NATO as an enemy. We don't see the Russian people as our enemies. We believe that all people should be able to live in free societies, have democracies, have market economies, and be secure.
So the Russian government is or isn't an enemy?
We don't declare it an enemy at all.
Ambassador Kurt Volker, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Stumbling into a new Cold War with Russia is one concern for the alliance, but how will NATO confront other growing threats? Or is NATO expanding too far beyond its original mandate? To discuss, I'm joined by Colonel Douglas McGregor, combat veteran and author of 5 books, including Margin of Victory, and Donald Jensen, editor-in-chief and a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Donald Jensen, after the end of the Cold War, obviously the original mandate of NATO became anachronistic. It had to reinvent itself, but did it?
Well, I think the mandate's change, in one sense, has changed. And to expand and meet new threats such as terrorism, such as cyber, And those things, I think, are understandably concerns of the alliance within its general dictate to defend Western values, to defend Western security. And I think the expansion, such as it has been, is quite understandable and actually has really gone a lot to help advance U.S. security.
Douglas McGregor, what do you say to this? Having just the one major military alliance in the world, is it, as you see it, a source of stability, or is it a threat to the rest of the world?
Well, it's not a threat necessarily to the rest of the world. It's simply an alliance that has no raison d'etre strategically any longer for all of its members. It's grown way beyond its original intent. It includes many, many small nations now who have agendas that do not align with the interests of the United States and its original founders. So I think the problem is that any alliance only lasts as long as the interests are shared by all of the members. Today, if you're sitting in Greece, Bulgaria, much like the Serbs, you view the Russians as potential allies in the event of a future conflict with the Turks. If you're sitting in Ankara, you're looking to the east and you see a potentially friendly power that wants to do business with you. Why would you want to be part of an alliance that is incurably anti-Russian?
It's interesting. You mentioned Turkey, and so to you, Donald Jensen, this whole idea of tensions brewing within NATO, not just between European nations and the United States, but on NATO's southern flank between the US and Turkey. The fact that Ankara purchased Russian-made S-400 defense systems is quite illustrative, isn't it, of this very deep unease, isn't it?
Yes, I would see the Turkish behavior recently, the flirtation with Putin and Iran and China, as an outlier on the general cohesion of the alliance. My friend Doug talked about differences of perspective among alliance members, and that's true. But on the basic core issues of security, about resisting the Russian threat, about protecting themselves from cyber activity, for example, they have common alliance interests, and that's what NATO is designed to ensure and protect.
Does NATO also play a role in advancing US hegemony? I mean, it has served the United States' vital interests quite well, not to mention the commercial interest of the industrial and military complex, hasn't it?
Well, I think we, that is the United States, have tried very hard to extract a strategic value from NATO for our purposes in other areas. But I think if you go to Warsaw and you talk to someone other than the senior people in the government, no one in Warsaw expects any Russian tanks to roll over the border anytime soon.
We must be talking, my friend, to different people in Warsaw, because I think the Poles overwhelmingly see a Russian threat. And I would define the threat in a 21st century way. It's not just troops rolling into the Suwalki Gap. It's cyber, it's economic pressure. We've seen the controversy over Nord Stream 2. And those instances are not strictly military, but those instances are threats to the security nevertheless. Russia wants to undermine the Western democracies. Russia wants to sow chaos. Russia wants to pump disinformation into the American body politic. So we believe their narrative and not ours.
The Russians very definitely saw the movement of U.S. forces eastward as a serious threat to them. And we made promises to the Russians at the time that we would not push east. There was an agreed line beyond which we would not go. We have effectively abandoned all of that, ignored it. We're ignoring Russian national security interests. We're treating them as though their interests are completely illegitimate. And finally, if Mexico, let us say, decided to sign an alliance with Russia, we would very definitely intervene in Mexico to stop that from occurring. So I don't think we can simply dismiss Ukraine out of hand as simply just another state. If it wants to join NATO, it should be allowed to do so. I think you have to admit that Russia has legitimate national security interests.
Well, unfortunately, Doug, Russia sees its national interests as subordinating its neighboring countries to Moscow's domination. Russia has trouble seeing an external environment which is not hostile because Russia wants to pump up the hostility to preserve the regime. And so Russia has no business deciding for Ukraine where it goes. Russia has no business deciding for Estonia or Turkey or where they go. That's their decision to make.
Some former US ambassadors to NATO have actually been warning that Trump has dragged the alliance into the most worrisome crisis in memory. Can the alliance survive President Trump? To you both, in a nutshell.
Well, I think President Trump was right when he said it was obsolete and he saw no purpose in it any longer. I wish that he would go back to that original position, frankly. I think the Europeans need to take responsibility for Europe. We've decided, for reasons of defense spending and national, I would say, narcissism, that Russia and China must be viewed as these satanic forces that must be defeated at all costs. I don't see them in that light at all.
Well, I don't think see them as satanic. I see them as threats. I actually agree with the president that the NATO allies should pay their fair share. And in fact, historically, Turkey often, Greece now, Estonia now, do pay their fair share. And I think the 2% and lobbying for a 2% goal is a good foreign policy goal for this country. But I think we have to calculate this in a more nuanced way.
Donald Jensen and Colonel Douglas McGregor, thank you both very much indeed. So as NATO continues to look for ways to stay relevant, will it be tempted by new military adventures as it pursues its expansion eastward? The alliance's future will largely depend on its European members' ability to overcome internal tensions and President Trump's public rebukes while continuing to play second fiddle to the United States. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and all the team here, thanks for watching. See you next time.